A reading from Matthew chapter 23, verse 37, and chapter 5, verse 4. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often have I desired to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted.
This year marks the 37th anniversary of one of the greatest films of all time, the definitive American road trip comedy Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, which has become a perennial Thanksgiving tradition, not only for its endless laughs, but for its timeless lesson on empathy and human connection. In the film, Steve Martin plays Neil Page, an advertising executive trying to get home from New York to Chicago for Thanksgiving. And snowstorms and detours, other obstacles frustrate his plans, but Neil's greatest challenge comes when fate handcuffs him to the lovable but obnoxious shower curtain ring salesman Del Griffith, played by John Candy. And for 3 days, as these two improbable companions travel via every mode of transportation, they endure a hotel robbery, a train breakdown, a car fire, and countless indignities as Neil's patience and sanity are pushed to the breaking point. And what makes the film so endearing is that despite their seemingly irreconcilable differences, we sense as viewers that these two incompatible characters somehow need each other, that somehow each, strangely, is the other's salvation. And perhaps this is what makes this film so relevant to our present-day context more than 35 years later, in a time of so much polarization and tribalism. Maybe it's a reminder that those who are most unlike us are not enemies to be defeated or obstacles to be avoided, but the very ones who can help us find our way home, if only we are willing to make the journey with them. I know it's just a film, of course, but sometimes the best art seems to imitate life. These two people couldn't be more different from one another, each trying to find their way home. Neil is polite, polished, and reserved. Del is loud, messy, and gregarious. Neil is uptight and judgy. Del is oafish and unguarded. Neil is all filter and Del has no filter. Neil is easily annoyed by anyone and Del is he's a walking hug who befriends everyone. Neil is quiet and thoughtful. Del is chatty and full of bad advice and crass jokes. And while all Neil wants is to finally rid himself of Del, all Del wants is to help Neil get home for Thanksgiving. It's a portrait of life, isn't it? Two disparate people, unlike each other in every way, forced to journey through life together. Sometimes we find ourselves alongside people who seem intent on just driving us crazy or thwarting our plans or making our lives difficult. Maybe it's the coworker who constantly shirks responsibility or tries to one-up you, or the neighbor whose sole mission in life, it seems, is to constantly get under your skin, or the family member who is deeply and stridently entrenched on the political side, the other side of the aisle, or that friend of a friend who always seems to bring unnecessary drama with them to every gathering. The Apostle Paul called them a thorn in the flesh, the people who have a knack for making our lives harder than they need to be, who we just can't seem to escape, who we just have to endure. In the movie, Del is Neil's thorn in the flesh. He turns that road trip into a nightmare, and it's hilarious to watch because Haven't we all met Del Griffith at some point in our lives? And aren't we all a little bit like Neil Page, always sort of ready to be pushed to that breaking point when that happens and when we finally are ready to just explode? In this series, we're talking about nonviolent communication, about how when things get heated and tense, how we can be in communication with one another in ways that help us get our needs met without doing harm in the process. Particularly when we're at that breaking point and we're about to just go off. How do we stay focused on what we really need and still avoid saying something we will later regret, even if in the moment what we really want to say might feel really good? There's a scene in the film that I think illustrates how we typically work out these intense moments. It happens when Del and Neil stop at a hotel, and Del immediately makes a mess of the place, and the two of them are forced to share a bed, a beer-soaked bed. And in that scene, Del repeatedly interrupts Neil's sleep until Neil can't take it anymore, and he jumps out of bed, and he delivers that blistering tirade, criticizing Del for boring people to death with his constant storytelling. And Neil says, you know, everything is not an anecdote. You have to discriminate. You choose things that are funny or mildly amusing or interesting. You're a miracle. Your stories have none of that. They're not even amusing accidentally. And by the way, he says, when you're telling these little stories, here's a good idea. Have a point. It makes it so much more interesting for the listener. And it's a funny scene, and we laugh, but then we see that Del is wounded, and then we suddenly know that we're no longer watching a straight comedy. We're watching real life, our life, and the hurt that happens whenever we cross the line and tear another person down. This series is about how to talk like Jesus, especially with those who are so different from us, knowing how easily our conversations can turn violent if our aim is to win every argument or to defeat the one with whom we disagree. How do we talk to each other nonviolently in ways that leave open the possibility for an ongoing relationship, even in the face of disagreement? And we learned last week about the power of observation, the first step in interrupting the cycle of violence in an argument or a heated conversation. Observation without evaluation or judgment. It simply identifies the behavior that you don't like without attaching any moral judgment or meaning to it. Without observation, with observation, we can simply name the facts that are true. It might work this way. You ask your teenager, would you please take out the trash? And your teenager said he would, but then a whole day goes by and the trash has yet to be taken out, and now you're not feeling particularly happy about your trash situation. And now, of course, it's not just about the trash, right? And so you might say to your teenager, do you have a hearing problem? I mean, do we need to call the doctor and have your hearing checked? And why don't you ever do anything I ever ask you to do? It's because you're lazy. Just like your friends, they're all lazy, except for Jake. I really like Jake. If only you were more like Jake. It's just a hypothetical. It probably never happens. But you get the point. Chances are that kind of talk will never resolve your trash situation. Observation simply begins with the facts. I asked you to take out the trash this morning. It's now evening, and you have not taken out the trash. Marshall Rosenberg, the pioneer of nonviolent communication, said the highest form of human intelligence is to be able to observe without evaluating. Stating the facts. Maybe it will resolve the trash crisis with your teenager, maybe not. It probably won't immediately resolve the more complex conflicts in your life. But as we saw last week, it will name the issue at hand without casting judgments on the other, which will only lead to defensiveness and escalation. Observation reestablishes human connection, mutually seeing and understanding, so that we're all talking about the same issue. And once we observe, Rosenberg taught that our next step is to communicate our feelings. And he said that most of us are illiterate when it comes to communicating our feelings. We simply do not know how to express our feelings in the modern world. Maybe that's because there's a stigma around talking about our feelings these days. For many, expressing our feelings can be perceived as a sign of weakness, a sign of vulnerability that drives us to repress or bottle up our emotions, which in turn can lead to self-isolating or self-numbing behaviors, or even to outward acts of violence. Perhaps this cultural stigma around expressing our feelings is best captured in that hit song by the Eagles from back in the 90s, Get Over It. This critique of the therapeutic age, a call to suck it up and stop being so sensitive. Do you remember that song? All this whine and cry and pitch and a fit. Get over it, get over it. But expressing our feelings is not about whining and crying and pitching a fit. In fact, those are often just cheap substitutes for our true feelings. They can become barriers to creating genuine empathy. If we want to communicate in healthy ways with those with whom we disagree, we need to express our feelings in ways that do not manipulate or create defensiveness in the other. And Rosenberg believed that it's as simple as expressing how we feel when that person behaves in ways we do not like. In other words, when you do that behavior, we might say, "This is how I feel." When you do not take out the trash after being asked, I feel angry, frustrated, or annoyed. It sounds easy, but we're not very skilled at this, it turns out, because more often than not, we seek to assign intent to that person's behavior, or to interpret it, or even to overstate it. And this is how society trains us to deal with conflict. We have learned to turn our feelings into grievances, because this is how we win an argument at the office, in our homes and neighborhoods, and of course, especially in the world of politics. Often what we think are feelings that we're expressing are actually grievances. And it's easy to confuse the two. A grievance is the story we tell ourselves about why we feel the way we feel. It's a justification for our feelings. Whenever behaviors we do not like go unchecked, and we believe that our feelings about those behaviors are ignored or dismissed, this sense of moral injury sets in, and our feelings give rise to grievances. And grievances always demand justice, a justice in which someone must be guilty. But the aim in expressing our feelings is not to assign motive or even guilt. It's simply to identify how you feel as a result of the other person's behavior. The goal is not to judge the behavior of the person, but to be seen and understood. And there's a poignant moment in the life of Jesus when Jesus shows us what this can really look like. It occurs near the end of his earthly ministry, just after he enters the city of Jerusalem. And by going into Jerusalem, Jesus was, in effect, surrendering to those who wanted him dead. He would soon be arrested and tried and crucified, but before the curtain would come down on his life, Jesus would have a few things to say about these people. Matthew 23 is a harsh polemic about the scribes and Pharisees. Jesus denounces them for their hypocrisy, their duplicity, their blindness to justice and mercy, their treatment of the prophets, and their love for power. It's pretty brutal. He calls them snakes, a brood of vipers, hypocrites and blind guides, none of which exactly fit the definition of what we would call nonviolent communication, except that Jesus was a prophet, and this is what the role of a prophet was, to speak truth to power. And a prophet's job was not to condemn or express divine hatred for people, but simply to reveal the gaps between what the people professed to believe and what they actually practiced. And so in Matthew 23, Jesus speaks the harsh truth out of deep, deep love. Over and over again, he says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees." He lists this whole litany of their sins, and after he gets through all those woe to yous, he concludes with the words you heard in our scripture today. Tender words, actually. "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how often have I desired to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing." I've searched and I can't find any other occasion in all the Gospels in which Jesus reveals the depth of his heart with such tenderness and vulnerability, revealing his deepest feelings about why he came to his people in love and how deeply it hurt to be rejected by them. Here we have a glimpse of the vulnerability of Jesus and his willingness to reveal his innermost feelings. It is, he says, as though I were a mother hen longing to gather her brood under her wings. That's how deeply, in other words, he's saying, that's how deeply I longed to draw you in, but you weren't willing. This past summer, I came to understand this image of a mother hen and the brood under her wings in a whole new light. For 2 years now, our backyard has become a nursery of sorts for wild turkeys. Baby turkeys, to be clear, are not called chicks, but poults. And 2 years ago, we watched this mother turkey raise her 4 poults to adulthood from spring all the way to early winter. In late spring of this year, another turkey appeared, this one with 10 poults, which were soon reduced to 8 for reasons unknown. And by July, those 8 poults had grown to resemble something like little feathered footballs on stilts. Turkeys, as you may know, do not nest on the ground. Turkeys roost in trees. And each night, this mother turkey and her 8 poults, after a whole day of scavenging, would return to that same pine tree in our backyard. And somehow, by some aviation miracle that no aerospace engineer could possibly dream up, they would fly clumsily, one at a time, from the ground all the way up to some branch in that tree, where that mother turkey would wait and spread her wings wide. And those little poults would gather 4 to her left and 4 to her right under her wings. I thought of Jesus and how he spoke of himself as a mother hen gathering her brood. But turkeys are not the most beautiful or elegant creatures, and so I didn't hold that image too closely until one night in late July, when a powerful hail and electrical storm blew through our neighborhood, lasting more than an hour, stripping trees of leaves and branches and leaving behind mounds of debris everywhere. I couldn't imagine how any human might have survived that storm, let alone a mother turkey and her 8 little poults roosting unprotected in a tree. As it turned out, only 4 of those poults survived. And as I gathered the fallen the following morning, I couldn't help but imagine what that mother turkey must have endured as she protected the 4 that did survive, using her own body to shield her pulse from quarter-sized hail while clutching to her branch in gale force winds. And I thought of Jesus, and I understood love in a whole new way. And I understood, too, what he must have felt that day when he lamented over Jerusalem. How often have I desired to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you are not willing. And what made that statement so beautiful and so wonderfully vulnerable was that it was spoken in love to those who plotted against him. Even in the most difficult of moments, instead of offering a grievance, he offered grace. It's how Jesus kept the conversation going, a conversation that is still going today, by revealing what he was feeling even today, this longing to gather even his enemies under his wings. He still makes reconciliation and salvation possible. It reminds me of a story Frederick Buechner told about being at a dinner party and finding himself sitting next to a woman he'd known for years. She was somebody he'd always valued and admired, but for one reason or another, this air between them was shadowed and bent. And at the table that night, he found himself telling this woman about a dream that he had had about her just a few nights before. And he told her that he had dreamed that he was sitting beside her just like he was sitting beside her right there at the dinner table that night. And that suddenly in the dream, he turned to her and he said, "I love you." And Buechner says, I then told her something else, which I didn't think I realized until that moment. I told her that what I said to her in the dream was true. And he said, I saw immediately that she was as moved as I was. And all at once, the air between us was full of healing and kindness. And it marked the end of a war and gave me a glimpse, he says, of the peace that she and I and all of us hunger above all else to find. Our takeaways for today: those who are most unlike us may be essential to finding our way home. Knowing the difference between a feeling and a grievance is the key to being understood. Speak what you feel with an aim toward love.